Welcome to the channel, guys. Coming to you guys 2 days late, which is actually on time for me, really. So I still need to get used to screen recording my studies, which tend to be a bit messier and more embarrassing and not something I really like to show. But since this channel is supposed to document my entire art progress, I will make sure to record them in the future. But what I'm saying is, I did a few studies this week for this piece that you're looking at right now that took a good amount of time, and I'll make sure to add into the video later. And that contributed to the second video being a bit late. And after being low-key roasted by my friends for the quality of my last voiceover, Girl decided to make a script. So now my new system for doing voiceovers is to use my breaks between when I'm working on my drawing to note down a little bit about my process and what I was thinking while making the piece. Hopefully the voiceovers will slowly get better. No promises. So this video that you guys are looking at right now is going to show the time lapse of the digital portrait I did of this little wizard miniature guy. And since I painted his physical body before starting the channel, I don't have a time lapse of me doing that painting process. But I do think he was the first miniature that I decided to start this portrait series with. And the end result was this. So I believe I did this piece about half a year ago, just as quarantine was starting, and I wanted to do a rework of my old piece after feeling that I've made a good amount of improvement. So the piece that I'm showing now is what I made last week. And what I want to talk about this episode are the art-specific things that I feel like I've improved on that are contributors to the differences in the before and after paintings. And I'll also touch a little bit on the exercises that I did to practice these things. But before I get into that though, I want to summarize the process I used for making this piece. As always, I started with a traditional sketch that I'm throwing on the screen now, as I tend to feel more creative with my ideas and composition when working on paper than when I'm working on my iPad. And I actually skipped the color thumbnail part of the process this time, as I had the color scheme of the before image to work with, and instead just did a small value thumbnail that I painted right on top of for the final painting. So, getting into the things that I've improved on, right off the bat, I can see that one of the biggest problems with the before piece is the lack of realism, mainly from a lack of texture. Like, the cloth does not show almost any folds, and the rocks kind of look like rubber. So the key way that I improved at realism was to just do a bunch of photo studies. Yeah, pretty tedious and boring, but definitely big payoff. I did a bunch of drapery studies just for this newest painting that I'm going to put on the screen. This is what took up a good amount of time this week. So when trying to improve your realism in a piece or trying to learn texture, I definitely would recommend doing some realistic photo studies, and when doing them, I would focus on clarifying your light and shadow shapes, and particularly on getting the proper edge between the two. So an example I was given that demonstrates this really nicely is this image of the moon. And you can see that most of the texture detail is right at the edge between light and dark. And this changes slightly based on the exposure of your image. If your image is overexposed, you could possibly have a little bit more detail in the darks, as your lights will probably be like pure white, very washed out. And if your image is underexposed, your lights won't be as bright as they are in this image, and you might see a little bit more detail on there. So I think a lot of what prevented me from having realism in my piece before was probably my lack of rendering in the process, and that takes a bunch of patience, which I didn't have back then. And I think an important change in my mindset that allowed me to spend more time rendering my paintings was to not think of the amount of time I spend on something as something to be judged by. I think a lot of people try to use the fact that they work fast as something to be proud of, and I think that's true, but that comes with practice and having done the whole entire process multiple times such that you have that speed. It's not about cutting down any part of the process. I think cutting parts down will just end up making a worse painting. And I think that the mark of becoming a better artist is to see that the time that you spend on each piece is growing in relation to the quality of the piece that you make. I think that if you were to give me an unlimited amount of time and make a piece, I could only spend probably 2 or 3 days on it before, and now maybe I could spend 2 or 3 weeks and still see improvement with each additional day that I have. I do think the before piece took a less amount of time, maybe 1 or 2 days to make, and this recent one, I spent an entire week on doing the studies and thumbnails that made me better set up and confident to do the final piece, which I think took 3 days. Another difference that I see between the two pieces is a noticeable improvement in composition and overall harmony of the piece. While the before piece didn't technically have a bad overall composition, when you zoom in, the placement of the smaller elements, like the rocks and the sleeves, give the piece a sense of stiffness, whereas the rocks and the sleeves in the after piece have a sense of movement that the before piece is missing. The key idea that I was missing before was design elements. If you want to feel in control of or be able to design your pieces, you should start with specific objects that you want to use as design elements. These are things that don't have a set shape and you can use to map out the shapes and values that you want dominating your piece. Here I have 2 very frequently used design elements in the piece, the cloth and the cave rocks. When I was thinking of the rocks, I wasn't thinking too much about the actual structure of the rock or cave formation behind the wizard, but instead just the values and patterns that I wanted. I kind of picked out the rock shapes that I wanted from the darkness of the background and just let the formations be what they were naturally. And you want there to be overall themes in the piece. I designed the shape language of the cloth to be kind of spirally and swirly, and I wanted some of the rock formation to also reflect that. You can kind of see it in the pillar behind the wizard's head. I improved my composition by seeing some analysis done of some master painters that helped me understand how different pieces create motion. And I did some thumbnail studies of pieces that I really enjoyed the composition of. By doing all this, I was more aware of designing movement when I was doing the beginning stages and thumbnailing of this piece. Guys, I think the biggest secret to improving fast is this concept I've heard called iterative drawing or iterative painting. And I'm not going to state the formal definition for this because I don't know it, but the way I think of this principle is this. that practice is really just about making mistakes, trying to do things that you don't yet have the skills to do, and then fixing said mistakes. What I attribute to the speed at which I've improved for this past half a year, being more than I've improved all 4 years of college, is simply the number of finished paintings that I've done. And when I mean finished, I mean done to the best of my ability, spending the time I need just to make those small incremental improvements. And a tangent here is that the process of allowing myself the time to make those incremental improvements has actually taught me that the difference between a successful painting and a painting that often just doesn't quite work is in the foundation established in the thumbnailing and value composition stage, often in the beginning. In these past 6 months, I attempted to do a quote-unquote finished painting about once every 2 weeks. And I'll do studies in those 2 weeks that get me prepared to do the painting as well. And once the painting is done, I'll actually write down an analysis of what went wrong and what I could have improved on for the piece. And that typically becomes a basis for a future piece that I will work on. A good piece of advice that I've heard and practiced for the most part is to not tackle more than 1 or 2 things in a piece that you haven't yet gotten a handle on, or to not worry about more than those 1 or 2 things when considering if your piece is successful or not. For example, in this piece, I tried designing my rocks and drapery to create movement, and that wasn't something I've ever done before. But I can see that my color scheme and the lighting effect of the torch the wizard is holding didn't come out quite right. The torchlight isn't really interacting with the wizard body or the cave rocks all that much at all. And perhaps colored lighting effects are something that I can study and put into practice in the future. I'll also note that the process of making that lightning rod looking special effect was super difficult and could be studied and executed better in the future. But in summary, I do think that the piece that I did was a success, as I improved at using my design elements, and I feel that I improved with my comfort with the digital painting process as a whole. So I am already late on making my next video, so I will catch you guys later. Again, feel free to post video topic ideas in the chat. It is always hard to figure out what to talk about. Catch you guys later.